Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Darshan Talks. I'm your host, Darshan Talks. It's my mission to help you trust the people, trust the products you depend on. As you may know, I'm an attorney, I'm a pharmacist, and I advise companies with FDA-regulated products. So if you're thinking about drugs, wonder about medical devices, obsess over pharmacy, or are wondering how you can get the right nudge to make you do the right thing, this is the live stream for you. This is the interview for you. I do have to specify that I'm an attorney, but I'm not your attorney. I am a pharmacist, but I'm not your pharmacist. And she's a nudger, but not your nudger. So this is neither legal advice, it's not clinical advice, and it's not nudging advice. I do these live streams, these interviews, because they're a lot of fun, and I find myself learning something new every single time. But it's always nice to know when someone's listening. So if you like what you hear, please leave a comment, please subscribe. If you're on YouTube, please hit the bell icon and subscribe. If you want to ask our guest questions, please feel free to do so. After the talk, during the talk, please share the video. I do want to emphasize these are considerations. They don't necessarily reflect the opinions of the host or the guest or their employers. These are supposed to just be some food for thought, for lack of a better term. If you want to find me, you can find me on Twitter at Darshan Talks, or just go to our website at darshantalks.com. Our interview today is a perennial favorite. I thoroughly enjoy talking to her, and this forum has been a godsend because I get to talk to her often, and I get to learn from her every single time. So if you're interested in the area of nudging, if you're curious, how do you get people to do the right thing, then you're in the right place, because today's conversation is going to be about that. I'm hoping we're going to talk a little bit about inclusion. We're going to talk about health equity, hopefully talk about just diversity, equity, and inclusion. So DEI, if you will. So, but with the unique take of how do you do that with nudging behavior. Our guest today is, I always like to make sure I say this all right, because there's so much to say. She's a behavioral scientist at the BVA Nudge Unit, where she co-leads the healthcare division globally. Her passion lies in marrying the worlds of psychology, public health, and behavioral economics to craft impactful behavior change solutions across the healthcare ecosystem. She's also a subject matter expert on persuasive communication for the Region 2 Public Health Training Center at Columbia University. So we get to say we've had a Columbia professor on here, which is kind of cool. Prior to joining BVA Nudge Unit, she co-developed an industry-leading social science group at Global Marketing Network McCann Health. She also delivers visiting lectures on behavioral economics and choice architecture, and has a master's in public health at Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health, her alma mater. She can be reached, and I just want to clarify this, and we'll talk about this as well. She can be reached at Suzanne.Kirkendall at bvanudgeunit.com, or you can just find her on LinkedIn. So I'm really excited to have her on. I do also want to emphasize that she co-wrote a book that we're going to flash. So if you're interested in nudging, if you're curious about how this ties into, this is actually the link to the book, by the way. What I did notice is really smart. They put it on their website. They didn't give the Amazon link or anything. It's off the BVA Nudge Unit website, so you don't have to pay Amazon referral links, which is or referral affiliate link money, which is great. But I'm really, really happy to have her. Our guest for today, Suzanne Kirkendall. How are you?
Hey, Darshan. I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me back.
It's always a pleasure to have you back. I gather, and based on our quick pre-meeting conversation, you have been busy. You have actually had one of the first in-person meetings now. You went to a conference, and how was that?
Yeah, so just about a few weeks ago, I had the great opportunity to go to the Patient Experience Symposium in Boston.
Mm-hmm.
I'm based in New York, so I got to take an exciting little road trip and get out of the city for a few days. And for pretty much everyone there, it was our first in-person conference since COVID. So everybody was very excited to meet some new people face to face, but also still being very cautious, with our masks and so on. But it was a really great experience.
Are we expecting a COVID cluster?
I don't think so. This is a conference dedicated pretty much to people in hospital and health systems for the most part. So they know the drill. We're all vaccinated. We all keep our masks on unless we don't have, unless we're eating, that sort of thing. So I'm not too worried.
Very, very cool. So talk to me a little bit about this idea. So let's, again, for people who are new, and I find myself introducing this every single time because I'm I've spoken about this multiple times, and I raised this concept multiple times, but every single time someone goes, so what's nudging again? So what is nudging again?
What is nudging again? Yeah, it's a great question to start with. So nudging is the application of behavioral science, which is basically psychology, behavioral economics, sociology, anthropology, all of that, to guide people where you'd like them to go. So as you said earlier, make the right decisions, make better decisions. What's different about nudging from other types of interventions is that it's very small, it's very tactical, and it's done in the moment of choice. So it's all about how do we make the context around the actual time that person is making a decision, make it as easy as possible for them to make the best decision. So it's really about removing friction, guiding people where you want to go. And this can be anything from medication adherence to changing various health habits to, as you mentioned in the intro, encouraging DEI in workplaces and those sorts of things. So it has broad applications, which makes it really fun and a little bit hard to explain briefly.
Yes, it does. I mean, everything from the absolute evil to the absolute good and everything in between. So let's start with the absolute good, because everyone talks about the absolute evil, and that's just, at this point, kind of done. We already have people commenting.
What do we got?
Janan, Suzanne, you're so impressive. Just downloaded the book, loving the illustrations.
Excellent. Thank you for downloading the book. I'll add that we, I think in November, we're going to have a virtual kind of book launch chat with the author type of events. So the ebook is free to download on our website, just like Janan just did. So if you download it, you'll automatically get an invitation to that event to come, learn more and speak with the folks who put it all together, if that interests you.
Aren't you one of the people who put it all together?
I am. I did not lead the charge, but there is a healthcare chapter in there for sure.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about that. So we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. What is the role nudging can play in that?
Yeah, so as with anything, diversity, equity, and inclusion ultimately, ideally, comes down to behaviors that we want to see people doing. We can talk about the mindsets and the attitudes, and those have value and are obviously important. But at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we're seeing people behave in ways that are aligned with DEI. So we have done projects in various spaces through our management consulting vertical to encourage things like diversity in hiring practices, to do things like setting up promotion and review schemes to make sure that they're DEI adherent and these sorts of things. So every company and every situation is going to look differently in terms of exactly how you do that, but it's very much appropriate for a nudging approach if you have a very specific behavioral goal in mind, like hiring more DEI and those sorts of things.
Which is kind of interesting to me, right? Because to me, when I look at consultants and I deal with consultants, and I am a consultant, I find the fact that people are looking at overall systemic solutions, which is great. It's awesome. But what you're almost doing with nudging is saying, I don't care about most of that. I mean, it's great. We should be fixing that stuff anyways. But we can solve the immediate problem at the actual decision making point, and that is where you can see maximum. Well, the argument is you can see a significant effect because of that. Is that a fair sort of summary, or not quite?
Yeah, so nudging is, one of the tools in your toolbox when it comes to changing any kind of behavior. And ideally, the way that I work and my colleagues tend to work is that, we use nudging at the end of the day for our tactical executions, and it's very powerful for that. And we have other behavioral science things in our toolkit to help us with the bigger picture, more strategic things, and to help us think about kind of the systemic level as well. So you think about it in those layers and make sure that they all come together at the end of the day. So for something like DEI, absolutely, the systems still matter, and no nudge is going to overcome, an unequal system, but it can help you go in the right direction. And ideally, if you add up the nudges all together, then you will start to see some movement. And to your point, it is usually a good kind of bang for your buck approach. So when resources are limited, something like a nudge is usually not expensive to implement. So it can be just a nice thing to really just optimize whatever it is that you're doing, hopefully systemically as well.
So to Tia's question,
yeah.
if you're trying to actually give a concrete example of a nudge, I'm going to give one that that sort of is in people's minds. So unfortunately, it happens to be a more negative nudge, but it is what it is. It's the type of nudge that keeps you on Facebook. Facebook sort of goes, "Are you sure you want to close it?" It forces you to make choices. Not forces. Forces is the wrong term. It pushes you to make choices that maybe you'll sort of veer away from if you can help. I think a good example of a nudge might be in an email campaign where they make you go through multiple hoops to unsubscribe, and that nudge might be a way of saying maybe it's not worth the effort to do that. Is that a fair example? What's a positive example of a nudge?
I love, first of all, that I don't even need to give the examples. You already know, Darshan. Obviously, we've been talking enough. I'm thrilled. And second of all, it's hilarious to me that you went to the negative ones. So yes, I'll throw in some positive ones. So an example that I like to use often when I'm kind of introducing the concept to my clients, which is totally not related to healthcare, but is really fun, is a really classic example of a problem that an airport in Europe was having in the men's restroom. So they were having issues with spillage causing really high cleaning costs for them. And they had put up all these signs, telling people what to do and these sorts of things, but it wasn't happening. So what they ended up doing was they etched a little fly into the back of the urinal as kind of a nudge or to provide a guide, right? In almost kind of a very simple gamification approach. And they found that this reduced spillage and therefore cleaning costs by 80%. So they didn't make anybody do anything. They didn't punish people. Nobody was arrested or fined. The restrooms weren't closed. They just put in that little guide in that context of the moment of decision to make it easy and in this case fun to do that desired behavior. So that one I always put in just to make sure people are awake, because they're like, wait a minute, why is there a picture of a toilet on the PowerPoint slide? Am I at the right meeting? But it's a really good example of something where it's so low cost, it's so low effort, but it's related to a really good understanding of your target audience and what motivates them, right? What's going to be meaningful for the people that you're trying to nudge, and then, the really great bang for your buck on that 80% reduction in cleaning costs at the end of the day.
So let's apply that example to, say, DEI, and we're talking about, let's say, a situation where someone is trying to decide what board members to have. How do you help create systems to create a nudge that pushes for a more diverse group of people to be part of your board membership?
Yeah, so some of the solutions that we can come up with in that case, or have come up with in the past related to DEI, have been even things like a little bit more up the funnel in terms of where are you posting your job or your board opportunities? Are you posting them in kind of the usual places or only on the alumni job boards for certain universities, and forgetting that perhaps people who are outside your usual group that you tend to recruit are not on the same websites or not inclined to go in those same directions. You also need to start thinking about things like the messenger is a very powerful nudge approach, which is who is this message coming from? Whose name is on it? What email address are they using? Like, who is this person, and are they to your target audience, right? So if it's a relatable person or someone who's more trustworthy, you're more likely to get engagement from any target audience, whether you're recruiting for a board member, trying to convince people to get vaccinated. The messenger is another very powerful nudge tool that you can start to think of. But it can get really quite broad and specific and quite fun to play around with, but it becomes very context specific. We always talk about context is king when it comes to any kind of behavioral science solution. So it would really depend on exactly what target audience you're trying to recruit and what the barriers have been up until that point in that specific board recruitment drive and so on. So
I love how you gave the examples of the messenger. One of the things I always think about it, for example, in board recruitment, is the idea that these are often, new board members are often based on referrals from old board members. And if your old board was white Anglo-Saxon male, for better or for worse, those are going to be the types of people they hang out with.
That's right.
And the result of that would be you're less likely to get a more diverse board if that's who you sort of depend on. But the logic is you depend on them because they've guided you so well the whole time. So
Hopefully,
though you are looking for new board members. But the question I ask is, how? What I'm really describing without saying it is this problem of inertia, where you need to convince someone that moving away from what they know is worth it. So is that an educational campaign, or can you actually remove the friction via nudges there?
yeah. So I love that you've named inertia as a major driver. So this is something that myself and a lot of other behavioral scientists will tell you is actually the most powerful behavioral driver is inertia. We are just wired to keep doing what we're doing because for us it's the easiest. Even if, we've all had the experience of our habits are maybe not optimal, maybe not serving us the way that we want to, but it's hard to change them because it's what we're used to. And that could be anything from your Netflix habit to your hiring habits, right? So when it comes to getting out of inertia and trying to move people past that to whatever desired behavior you're trying to work towards, it is a combination of things. Usually education is not what's needed. Especially in the healthcare space, we know we do a ton of education and we throw information at people all the time. And when I say people, I mean patients, but I also mean healthcare providers. That it's not lack of information that's usually the problem. So it does become more that second thing that you named, which is making it easier and removing friction wherever possible. So that's where you start to look at what are the micro barriers between this person and their desired behavior. And you can get to that through various ethnography techniques and different interview techniques to understand exactly what's standing between, person in current state versus person in desired state. And then once you understand those micro barriers for that specific context, you can create the nudges to target each one of those and kind of knock them out one by one, so to speak.
So, this is more of a philosophical question, but are we coming to a point where we've addressed major barriers and we're now finding that the micro barriers add up to major barriers? And what I'm referring to is I've heard the term microaggressions, and now we're talking about micro barriers. Are we sort of saying that microaggressions can land up collectively excluding people? So similarly, micro barriers collectively land up excluding people, and therefore the idea is that if you can address these individual topics, you can have a much larger impact than any individual change, if you will. Does that? I don't know if I phrased that properly.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you're linking the micro barriers to the microaggressions as it relates to DEI and so on. I think in terms of, yes, so both of them, I think the micro implies that they kind of have the cumulative effect, right? And none of them are really big dramatic things necessarily. But when it comes to, I would still discuss them as separate topics.
Okay.
Because micro barriers are going to be there for any behavior, not just DEI. So there will be micro barriers to medication adherence, to exercising every day, and so on.
Yeah.
And so, and there would also be barriers related to microaggressions and so on. So that would be I would still keep them separate, but both of them have that cumulative effect over time. But the barriers are important because, and we talk about micro barriers because a lot of people will stop at the normal size barriers that are easy to spot without this kind of behavioral science fine-tooth comb that we can use to uncover the things that people don't even realize are holding them back. And that's where the power of nudge and behavioral economics comes in, because it's all about, or a lot of it is about looking at the unconscious drivers of behavior, not just the conscious ones. So an example in the healthcare space that I run into a lot is when we're talking with clients who are saying, we have the new product that actually has the best data out there and people aren't using it like they could be using it. They're using it at fourth line when it's really appropriate for second line and it's objectively better. What's going on? But when you go and talk to the doctors about, well, why do you make the prescribing decisions that you do, right? And of course they're going to say, well, I read the data, I'm a doctor, I'm data driven, duh. And it's like, yes, of course. I'm not calling you bad at your job. That's not what this is. Right. It's just doctors are people too. People have habits, and habits can be hard to overcome, especially when you consider the context of being a practicing healthcare provider, when you are slammed and crazy busy and you don't have time to carefully reflect on every decision you make throughout the day, right? So that's the systemic issue impacting us up here, right, before we get down to the nudge level. So this is where they start to layer in. So I talk about all of that to say, if you ask somebody why they do something, they're probably not going to be able to tell you the right answer, even if they think they do, because that's just a blindness that we all have. So the micro barriers as opposed to normal barriers comes in because we are trying to get to what are the reasons people don't even necessarily consciously realize are getting in their way of doing this behavior. And that's where the nudges can come in to address both those and the normal barriers in many cases as well.
So it's interesting you talk a little bit about how you start identifying the problems. And the first thing that stuck out to me is, have you read the book, The Long Tail? I
have not.
Okay, so essentially the argument in the book is that everyone, you think of the curves, and you sort of see the edges of it, and most people sort of fall within the majority, but then you start going further and further and further down. Everyone sort of ignores that because they're just one-offs or they're unusual, but that's where you see a lot of the impact. So what I hear you saying in many cases is people are focusing on all the big changes. And that's great, and we should be solving those anyways. But what I hear you saying is that by nudging, we can also address some of these other smaller changes that can collectively impact the bigger ones as well, which I think is amazing. But the second comment I wanted to make was how you go about. You talked a little bit about. First of all, did you want to respond to that? I kind of jumped from a concept to another one.
No, that's okay. I don't.
There's nothing there.
No. There's plenty there, but you got get your thought out.
Okay. The other question I kind of had was, what are useful tools to evaluate what types of nudges to look at? On one hand, I can see interviews and going, what makes you make decisions? But you just said a second ago that people don't actually know why they make the decisions they make. They just do. In which case, is it observation? And can a observation be insulting? And
love this.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so really good questions. So in terms of how do we figure this out? If nobody can tell us, how do we know? Are we mind readers? What's going on? So yes, interviews are a good starting point, and they're always something that we will do. And it's not just going to necessarily be an interview in a typical qualitative research style where you're just like, tell me about why you do this, because as we just said, that's not enough. So part of what we'll do in the interviews will be various projective exercises and techniques to try to get a little bit more past that logical, rational thinking, which is totally ignoring the subconscious drivers for behavior. So I know we've talked about these before, but essentially these are exercises that we'll do where it's a little bit more like playing kind of imagination games with people. And by getting people out of their normal, I'm talking about medicine at work because I'm a doctor. You start talking about like, what would this drug wear to a party and these sorts of things. It gets really silly. And you do that to kind of shortcut back to a little bit more subconscious thinking, and you can do some interpretation from there. But then, of course, as you said, observation. That's the best. That's always what we try to recommend as much as possible. Ethnography, whether it's virtual or in person as appropriate, is ideal because then you can see the person in the context, in the moment, actually making the decision. And, there's just no perfect substitute for that. In the pandemic, obviously, that's been harder. So there are ways that you can do virtual ethnography, which is quite fun. It involves typically a lot of kind of discussion board over a period of time where people will submit videos of themselves doing the thing in real life and answer various questions. So you can get as close as you can, safely.
So first of all, I have to admit, once you started talking, I kind of lost you for a second because I kept visualizing what would Xanax wear to a party. And
what do you think, Darshan? Tell me.
I'm thinking Xanax is kind of really chill. Like, that's what I'm thinking.
That fits. This is like I have the Rorschach ink blots as
I saw them.
my art in my living room. That's how much I live into this stuff. And people always start telling me what they see on the ink blots, and I'm like, "Are you sure you wanna? You sure you wanna reveal this much, you guys? You're telling on yourself." But yeah, anyway.
One of my favorite books is Atomic Habits, and I love the idea of micro habits. I don't know what the distinction is, to be honest. Small changes towards behavioral change. How does this relate to nudging, and how could I use nudging in my own life?
I love this question. Thank you, Janan. So this is actually a book that I've been talking about with a few people recently, and it's very nudge adjacent. So things things like micro habits are going to be like little changes. So if you want to start exercising 30 minutes 4 days a week, and that's a totally new habit for you, you're not going to start by just jumping in from 0 to 100 like that. You're going to start by building up and shaping your own behavior gradually over time. So you're going to start with if you really want to start at level 0, which you probably should, you're going to start with 1 day a week, 5-minute walk. Next week, 2 days a week, 5-minute walk. Work your way up to the number of days a week, and then start increasing your amount of time that you're doing your exercise until eventually you're at that big behavioral change of 30 minutes of exercise 4 days a week, right? So the way that nudges can link into this is more around how do you get yourself to start doing these things. So if you want to do your 5-minute walk, a nudge for yourself to help you with that micro habit would be set an alarm for the time that you want to do your walk so you can't forget, and so it feels like a little bit of accountability. You can also use lots of other nudge things like leave your clothes out. If you're going to do your walk in the morning, leave your exercise clothes out on your bed so you can't ignore it, and so it's easier for you to get dressed and get going. You're removing friction from yourself when you're actually doing the process, those sorts of things. So we definitely, the theory of habits and how they work and how they form and how you can change them is something that I work with very often. We've talked about prescribing habits and so on. So it helps you set up conceptually what you need to do, and then the nudging comes in to help you get to the how you're going to do it. So I hope that helps.
Nudging seems like a motivation to perform that consistent habit change. Thank you.
Yeah, it's the motivation, it's the system as well. Because as I said at the beginning, whenever I'm talking to someone about changing behavior, you don't just talk about what is the goal you want to do, which in this case would be, 4 days a week of exercise. It would be, what is the system? So you start with the goal, but then you must work backwards and set up the system for yourself if you're going to be successful with that. So it's the motivation and it's the mechanisms of the system to help you make that consistent habit change.
Love it. So here's a question. One of the things, and I'm already well past time, but I'm going to ask this question anyways. When we talk about how you cause change, we talk about DEI, but we sort of nudged our way into sales, for lack of a better term. We found ourselves talking a little bit about how physicians decide which product they should prescribe. And you said the best way to get that is by observation, to see what they actually do. How do you do that in a world of HIPAA?
Yeah, so nudging in healthcare is a bit of a unique beast. So at BVA Nudge Unit, we work across all different industries. So we'll work in FMCG, in transportation, all over the place, because wherever people are, there's human psychology, and you probably want somebody to do something. So we can help. But in healthcare, the game becomes a little more complicated because of things like HIPAA and various privacy rules and just general access issues. So in those cases, if we're talking specifically about physician prescribing habits, we tend to go more in the direction of interviews and projection exercises. We also look at the data and look at patterns in the data that we can see that might indicate what's going on beyond what any individual doctor can tell us. We always try to layer that in as well and be very data driven. And then the other things that we draw on are basically the evidence base from the field, in the sense that, there's lots of research on doctor decision making that you can draw on for best practices. There's also, our behavioral science evidence base around the unconscious habits in thinking that we all have, the biases and heuristics you may have heard of if you read any of the books in this space, which are kind of the subconscious shortcuts that our brains all use to help us process the world more efficiently. So if we know those patterns, in how we subconsciously decide, just because we all have human brains, then you can start to say, well, these are things to look for not only in the interviews, but just in general, and make sure that you're accounting for those patterns that you know are common across all human decision making. So it becomes a combination of best practices, specific evidence, and as much as you can glean from any kind of interviews and exercises that you do with your target audience.
So this is perfect for me to challenge you on this, because I love where this takes us. Because what you're talking about is using data-driven decisions. The problem with data-driven decisions is they will always reflect the majority.
Yep.
The problem with that is that you then ignore cultural differences. You ignore diversity, equity, inclusion type differences. So how do you account for that, since culture is unique? And how do you make sure that what you're proposing for hospital X or for company Y is appropriate for hospital X or company Y, because you're really basing it off of 50,000 doctors across the entire country?
Yeah, I love this question. It's a really important one because, to your point, most of the evidence in psychology and many other fields has been based traditionally on, college students who have to do it for their psych course, right? So that's kind of an internal thing that the field copes with. And of course, we are getting better at including more, real life people and more diverse groups of people in the research. But you're right. If we're going back to stuff for early in the field, it's not a super diverse population. So a few things there. And this is a question we answer a lot because BVA Nudge Unit is a global company. We've got offices in Europe and Asia and South America and the US. So culture is something that we are used to accounting for. And you do that by kind of the last part of what I was talking about. So you have the data-driven. And when we say data-driven, we're talking about best practices from the field. We're also talking about data from that specific context. So I want the data on the desired behavior from hospital X specifically, right? Not just on DEI hiring practices, for example, across the US. Right. I want to get the data specifically from that space so that we're looking at the right context. And then that's why the direct contact and involvement with the people who are your target audience is also crucial. So that's why we do the interviews, the exercises, the observations as much as we can as appropriate. And, a further best practice on top of that, where you can and where it's possible, is to actually co-create with members of your target audience the solutions that you're going to be coming up with. And there are a few good reasons for that. The first is, it'll be relevant to them, and it'll be motivating, and it'll be effective. The second is kind of making sure that it's ethical, and it's not going to be something that's going to annoy these people or really upset them or insult them in any way. So wherever you can, involving your target audience in the co-creation of your solutions is always ideal.
So, two questions have come out of that. I could keep going. I need to stop, but I can keep going. This is so much fun. You talk about co-creation. One of the statements I always read was never ask a fish. A fisherman should never ask a fish how to fish for them, because they wouldn't know. That's just not their life experience. A version of that is I've heard men tell other men and women tell other women that don't take advice from a woman how you should date, like how you go try to hit on women, because you've never learned. That's just not their life experience. My question to you is, trying to co-create something together. Does that necessarily work? Because they've never been in your shoes. They've never looked at their own behaviors. So how does that play itself out?
Yeah, I've thoughts about the dating. We'll get to that after the show. In terms of co-creation with people who are not behavioral scientists is basically what you're saying. And this is, I always say that translation education is at least 50% of my job, whoever I'm interacting with, because it's my job to be the expert. That's, I've got the training experience. That's what I'm here to provide. I can't possibly be the expert on somebody else's life experience, right? I have mine, and I know what, social groups I'm a part of, but there are many, many other walks of life that I don't have the insight into, and I don't pretend to. So that's where you see that everybody in the room has a different perspective to contribute, and that's why it's co-creation. I'm not saying you guys go make the nudges and tell us what you come up with. It's very, very interactive. It involves a lot of grounding in the basics of behavioral science and what are nudges. We also have many proprietary tools that make nudges really accessible and fun. Like we have something called the drivers of influence, which are the 21 pieces or little levers from behavioral science that we know are most motivating to people when we're coming up with nudges. So we have each of those 21 drivers on playing cards that have a description and examples, and a case study on there. And so we use those in these workshops, whether they're in person or virtual, to help with brainstorming these sorts of things. So we make it very accessible and simple so that anybody who's not a behavioral scientist can do this. And this is something that I do with my clients all the time. We regularly do workshops where the clients and us are coming up with nudges together to solve their problems. And the nudges that they come up with, will be things that are grounded in their deep knowledge of the context of, in this case, their business, but it could be, whatever it is, right? Whoever you're bringing in for that firsthand perspective. So it is the co-creation, the co-part of co-creation is very key here. But yeah, it's very possible. People have a lot of fun with it and come up with a lot of really great ideas once you give them the grounding and the tools to do so.
Very, very cool. Well, we really should. We're well past where I should be. But you're just always so much fun to talk to. As you know, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. The first thing is, how can people reach you?
So I love talking about this, obviously. So please feel free to reach out to me at my email, which is suzanne.kirkendall@bvanudgeunit.com. It's just on the screen here. Or look me up on LinkedIn. I'm on there pretty regularly, and I'm happy to hear from you there as well.
Perfect. Next question. What would you like to ask the audience?
I would like to ask the audience about, we've talked about the idea of like micro habits and using nudges to set themselves up for micro habits. I wonder if people have tried any of these things before, and I'd love to hear from you guys on your little ideas of how you've self-nudged, maybe not even on purpose, but, once we've added the definition to it, you realize that's what you were doing.
I'll give you an example of a self-nudge that I've used. I've put my keys close to the door so that when I'm walking out, I have my keys, my wallet, my cell phone, all close to that so that I'm not forgetting it. And I'm just going to one location, getting all of it, and walking out, which to me is an example of a nudge. It
is. I do the same thing. And a nudge I added onto that in the pandemic was I put little hanging hooks with my masks right by the door because early on it wasn't a habit. I kept forgetting my mask and I walk out and I feel naked without it. So then I have to run back in. So when you put it right by the door, you can't forget.
Exactly right.
Yep.
So my next question, what is something you've learned in the last month?
I learned, so I've been reading a book called Good to Great, which is kind of a classic business book by Jim Collins. It's very good. And one of the things that he talked about in there that I thought was really interesting was the idea of the Stockdale Paradox. And that's something where it came from an interview with this man who was a Vietnam vet who was a prisoner of war for 8 years. And he was tortured at least 20 times over the 8 years. He had an awful, awful experience. But he came out of it, alive, for one, and, a fairly intact human and functional member of society thereafter, despite that trauma. And so people have been like, how did you do that? And his advice was, he's like, well, who didn't last in this situation were the optimists, because what they would do is they would say, we'll be out of here by Christmas, and Christmas would come and go and they'd be so disappointed. And then they'd say, oh, well, Easter for sure, and Easter would come and go and they'd be devastated. Thanksgiving, definitely. Thanksgiving would come and go and they're still there. And he said they died of a broken heart, basically. So he said the people like me who made it out were the ones who had this dual mindset. And this relates to the goal setting that I was talking about. I have a point. He said the way I made it out was having an absolute belief that a positive outcome. He said we will get out of this. But then also simultaneously being brutally realistic about the facts of the situation and saying, he gave the example of we're probably going to be tortured again. So instead of just saying, don't give anything, be strong for America, that's setting people up for failure, right? So he said instead, we would say, okay, after this amount of time, you're allowed to give this piece of information, and it's okay, nobody will blame you for it. After this amount of time, this piece of information. So planning for the realities of the situation, while always holding tight to the firm belief that you were going to make it, was what made them succeed and get out of there alive. And so that's a really, much more dramatic real life example of what I was talking about with, you set the goal, which is, the firm belief in the outcome. But you must also create the system to help you get there using nudges, using theories of habits, and so on, being really realistic about those micro barriers along the way in order to succeed. If you just set the goal, like the optimist, you're like, yes, of course I'm going to exercise 4 days a week because I want to, and you don't do the system, you don't have that severe reality check, you won't make it. So that was something I learned in the last month.
That's really interesting. One of the things I've read about is this idea that hope is the most powerful thing in the world, and what I'm hearing you say is, no, it can also destroy you.
Hope hope is important. I'm not saying it's but as a behavioral scientist, I'm not a psychologist. I'm not here to do therapy or make people feel better. I'm here to change behavior. So if we're going to talk about changing behavior, you have to have hope and optimism because that's going to be the motivation. But you also need to set up the system. Very
cool. Janan has 2 comments, by the way. To answer your question about what was the question we asked? How have you self-nudged? So it's I've tried. It's how I self-nudged my way to losing weight during the pandemic, and will be using ideas to work out more regularly. So
amazing. Well done.
I'm not sure I agree with Janan on this one. Nudges through healthy swaps and new recipes. I'm not sure it's a nudge as much as a strategy.
It is a strategy that can have nudges attached to it. So the strategy is I'm going to make healthy swaps. The nudge is, setting yourself up for success by when you're at the grocery store, not buying the things that are unhealthy, only buying the healthy swaps. So then when it comes time to cook,
you have
a choice. It's easy, right? So that's a nudge. And lots of other ways that you can kind of execute on this that would be nudgy, but the strategy is important too. Like I said, nudge is the tactical execution of a layer of approaches. So sounds like you're on point, Janan. Congrats. Well done.
She is, because she's told me multiple times that she has a delicious recipe for cauliflower rice, and I refuse to believe that because that's not a thing. You can't have delicious cauliflower rice. I refuse to accept that.
5 words, oh boy.
So here's a new question that I've never asked you before, which is, what is something about you most people don't know?
Something most people don't know about me is, I don't know if you know this about me. I lived in Australia for high school and college.
Okay.
Yeah, so originally from Colorado. Obviously, I do not have an Australian accent. But when I was 13, my parents decided to move our family to Sydney. So I did high school, I did a gap year, and I did my undergraduate degree at the University of Sydney. And then I moved back to the U.S. to attend Mailman, Columbia's School of Public Health, about 5 years ago now.
How interesting was it for you to realize you were exotic in Sydney?
Hilarious question. You know what? I got so many people. The funniest question, when you're 13, 14 in high school, people are like, oh, do you ride the yellow school bus to school every day? Because they don't have that.
Right.
Just these little things that you don't realize, here things are normal to you, and then you go somewhere else. Right. And over there, they just use normal city buses, and it's repurposed for a school bus. So, yeah, it definitely was funny. Australian culture versus American culture. They, historically, they've definitely liked to emulate the U.S., but they also, like to tease a lot. That's very Australian. So it was exotic, but also, it's like a funny sibling relationship.
Absolutely. And last question. What is something that made you happy in the last week?
Ooh, lots of things. So I got to visit Chicago for a long weekend over the weekend, and that was my first time flying since last January, so almost 2 years.
Yeah.
And I went because a couple of my friends from grad school were getting married to each other, which was very sweet. But also my grandparents, my aunt and uncle live out there, so I had kind of a 2 birds, 1 stone. I got to visit the family and then go to the wedding. So it was a lovely weekend.
Wow, so you've just had a traveling sort of 2 months.
Yeah, making up for lost time. Boston, Chicago. I'm going to Mexico next week, hopefully.
Oh, wow.
Crazy. Yeah.
So are you expecting to see Ted Cruz?
I'm going to say I hope not and leave it at that.
Fair enough. He's having a hard time living that one down. But it's the timing. I'm not even commenting on the politics. I'm just commenting.
No, I know. Absolutely.
But no, this... It was, as always, wonderful to have you on, Suzanne, and I'm looking forward to having you back on. Hopefully we'll talk about sales, because I know I've been wanting to get into that, and this was a great sort of lead up to that. So, Suzanne, thank you again. Stating the obvious, you can reach Suzanne at suzanne.kirkendall at bvnudgeunit.com. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.